Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Very honorable students, friends, colleagues, learners, mentors, teachers. A very warm welcome in the holy month of Ramadan. And I hope and believe that you will be continuing with your supplications to Almighty Allah and to certainly solicit the will of Allah, the Radha of Allah. And while we are in the prayers and supplications and fasting during these holy days, certainly we are looking for the mercy and the protection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the entire humanity. And at the same time, we are also mindful about those hundreds of thousands of people who have become jobless, who have become without resources to make their life pass in an honorable way. So this is very important that we also take care of those people around us and we give them part of our comfort in this very hard days. So I will start with the recitation from the Holy Quran. Inna anzalnahu fi laylatil qadr wa ma adraka ma laylatul qadr. Laylatul qadr khayrun min alf shahr تنزل الملائكة والروح فيها بإذن ربهم من كل أمر سلام هي حتى مطلع الفجر. صدق الله العظيم. Today we are taking up another very important knowledge area of the project management, and this is again one of the core knowledge areas. If you remember, we discussed this last time that there are 4 important knowledge areas, and the 3 of these knowledge areas we already discussed. The 2, one is the cost, quality, and the 3rd one is time, and the 4th one is scope management. We will discuss the time management some time tomorrow, day after tomorrow. But today we will discuss the scope, the project scope management. Now the project scope is basically the boundaries of the project. Whatever included inside the project is its scope, and what is not included in the project is beyond its scope. When we come across the project management and project execution, the scope of the project is always a challenge. For example, if we are constructing a building, an approved area of the building is, for instance, 100,000 square feet or 10,000 square meter, then the biggest challenge during the design and execution is not only controlling the cost and time, but at the same time, beside the quality, we have a big challenge to control the scope within the approved boundary of the project. And generally, this variation in the scope of the project leads us to the time delays and also the cost overruns. So a good project manager would always keep his eyes or her eyes on the scope of the project so that the project scope is not changed to the possible extent. But again, the challenge is that the scope change comes during the currency of the project, because this is sometimes very slowly, and we often call it scopes creep, because the change is not very apparent, but at the end of the day, when the project is nearly completion, we have a lot of additional cost. So that's why the scope change management is very important, and we have to control the scope change management, the scope change in the projects. When we develop the conceptual plans of the projects and the projects are approved, definitely the scope of the project is not very well defined, and the boundaries are very very vague, in the sense that we don't have the exact designs. But certainly the scopes are described in terms of two things. One is the unit, and the other is the uh, cost. For instance, if we are constructing a building, then the scope may be defined in terms of the total covered area of the building, and then per square foot of cost, and then the total cost. Similarly, when we are procuring the finished goods like computers or laptops and other, then we have the specification. At the same time, we have the number of computers and the unit cost which is approved for that computer. Similarly, if we have the human resource development component in the project, so we can have the number of trainings, we can have the number of scholarships for the MS, for the PhD, and so on. So similarly, in case of furniture and fixtures, we can define the number of tangible items which will be delivered during the currency of the project at different timeline. Similarly, in case of services, we may define the man hours as the scope of the services which will be provided by the consultant. So in these all these scope definitions, we have a very clear indications and indicators for the scope control. But when we go in the project, certainly the scope which we define in the preliminary stage of the project is not able to be strictly followed, because many times during the design and the procurement of goods, we can come across some changes in the specifications, some changes in the quantities, some changes in the numbers, and so on. And this leads to a revised scope, and this scope change management is really a very tough thing in the projects, because the scope change or scope creep would always increase the cost, and it would also delay the project. So we have to keep in our mind that project scopes has to be very carefully monitored. But certainly, it's again not an issue. So the scope of the project, the works involved in creating the products of the project. So all the processes and works which are involved in the project to create the ultimate ends of the project for the customer use is called the scope. And it includes all processes which control what is and what is not included in the project. So the deliverables, which are the end products of the project, may be in the form of service, or it may be in the form of some product, it may be in the form of some works. So all these definitely will have some deliverables. The project team and stakeholder must have the same understanding. This is really very important, that when the project is conceived and the project is sponsored and the project is approved by the statutory bodies or by the sponsor, then definitely at both sides of the project, we need to have a very clear definition of the scope and the limits of the scope. Now, the scope management, we have 4 or 5 generic steps. The first is that we initiate the project and we develop the project charter, which describes the responsibilities of the project manager and also the relationship between different stakeholders. Then we plan the scope in the initial phase when the project is initiated. And then once the project is approved, then we create the work breakdown structures, and we try to define the various deliverables in terms of its units, specifications, and all the details are given to verify the quality and quantity of the project deliverables. And then once we are executing in the project, we have to verify the scope, that there is no change in the scope, and the scope of the deliverable is accepted. And finally, if there is any change in the project scope, then we have to change that scope, and there must be a scope change control system and a board to certainly control this change. Now, this is a sample of the scope management. For example, it gives us the information technology upgrade project, and there is a brief introduction. In this, there is a scope statement. Then there is a work breakdown structure. Then there is the verification of the project deliverables, and if there is any change request. So all these within this plane, if you see all these five things are very given in very detail, and we will discuss in the rest of the. This is the same project in which we have given the project start and finish date, the project manager, for instance, the project objectives, approach, that how this project will be done, what are the roles and responsibilities, and what are the sign-off of the projects, and if there are any comments. When we go into the scope management processes, for example, we collect the requirements from the client, from the user, from the end users, and based on these requirements, we develop the requirement document, and then this requirement document constitute the preliminary scope of the project, and then we go to the planning stage, we go to the detail scope, and we develop the project scope statement in the planning process, and then we develop the detail, which in fact is the detail scope in which we create the work breakdown structure. WBS stands for work breakdown structure in the planning stage. And then once we implement the project, we verify the scope by monitoring and controlling, and we accept the deliverables, and if there is any change due to the monitoring and controlling, we try to change, control the change in scope of the project, and we certainly have the change requests or variation orders. So the scope statement, which is normally the first phase that we, in the planning phase, we develop the scope planning, and normally the scope statement of the work may include the project justification, the project end deliverables and products, summary of the project deliverables, the scope management plan in terms of cost specification, schedule and technical specification, scope definition, and so on. Now, the scope definition is the process which is necessary for developing a detailed project scope statement as the basis for future project decision. So initially, we have the preliminary scope, project scope based on the user requirement, but when we go for detailed planning, we come up with the scope definition in which we have details. Like the scope definition, we have the project charter based on the previous judgment of the project managers and the senior managers. We develop the project charter, and this project charter then gives us the project scope statement. And then we also collect the requirement data, the product analysis, and in the project document in terms of requirements updated. And then we try to use the existing organizational assets to identify the alternative ways to do the projects, and maybe there are some facilities. Now, the work breakdown structure, which in fact is dividing the project into smaller components, so that these components are smaller and more manageable. For example, if we think about the Faculty of Engineering project in Karakoram University, this is about 700 million project, and within the project we have the civil work, we have the lab equipment, then there is IT equipment, there is a human resource development component, there is also a teaching and learning tools or methods, aids. Then we have some external development of the area, which include the boundary wall and all the external developments. And then there is a project staff. So we have 6 or 7 major components of this project. These projects are sub-projects are further divided. For example, if we go to the civil work, we can divide the civil work into 3 or 4 components. That is the main building. And then we can see there is roads, networks, then there might be some external electrification, external development, the external water supply and sanitation, and so on. Similarly, if we think about the IT equipment, within the IT equipment, then we can have a number of different subheads. So based on this, the project is divided into smaller and manageable components so that we can establish the responsibility and the monitoring over these subcomponents. And this is more like the management by objectives. If we remember from the early knowledge of the management by objective is a process in which we divide the overall objectives of the project into sub-objectives of different departments and divisions, and then we give them the task and resources, and based on their achievement, we then collectively see that whether the project can be achieved or not. Begin with the project scope statement, task description are develop the WBS to the lowest level, and normally the smallest work package should not be less than 80 hours. That would mean something like 2.5 weeks, something like 20 days. And then we have each work is developed to accomplish a discrete and separate element of work, assigned package to single organizational unit. And then we develop the organizational breakdown structure also. And then we organize the WBS maybe by phase of the project, maybe task, by activity, or steps, for example, hardware, software, and networking. Now, the approaches in which we divide the project into smaller manageable components may be some guidelines. For example, the government department in the Planning Commission has given us the certain templates to divide the project into smaller components, and which can be then monitored and also estimated. Another way is to develop the bidding process, because when we are going to the bidding process, we divide the project into different bids, and that bids are then telling us the different components of the project. The analogy approach is using the previously available template of the project. When we are doing similar projects like civil work or a building work, we can use the previously adopted work breakdown structure. The top-down approach is that we are splitting the largest component to smaller components, and we go from whole to parts. And this is normally done by the experienced project managers. When we are developing the project work breakdown structure, it is very customary that we develop the top-down approach, that we divide the entire project into smaller components. But when we are developing the estimates of the project, then we may go from parts to whole, which is from the entirely new system. After completing scope planning, the next step is to further define the work by breaking it into manageable pieces. We discussed this. A good scope definition helps improve the accuracy of time, cost, and resource estimate, defines a baseline for performance measurement and project control, and aids in communicating clear work responsibility. This is really very important. And in many projects, I have seen that the scope is not well defined. And when later on, when we go to the execution stage, we have a lot of problems with the scope control. Now, the work breakdown structure, or WBS, we discussed that this is a deliverable-oriented grouping of the work involved in project that defines the total scope of the project. It is foundation document in project management because it provides the basis for planning and managing project schedule, cost, and changes. This is an example that, for example, a software project is divided into first is the project management strategy, or the product requirement, detailed design, the construction, and the integration and testing. So we have 5 major subcomponents of the software development product. And then within project management, we have the planning, meeting, administration. In the software product requirement, we may go for the software, for the user documentation, training of the programs. In the detailed design, we can again go to the software user training. So based on the requirements of each and every subcomponents, we can further divide the projects of sub-projects into further subcomponents. This is another example that an aircraft system which is being developed, we can have the project management, we have the training, the data, the air vehicle support equipment, the facilities, the test and evaluation. And under each, we have further subcomponents like in the air vehicle, we have the airframe, the engine, the communication, navigation, fire control, and all other systems which are required for the aircraft system. So within each system, we have the subsystem or we have the sub-projects, and that these sub-projects can be further divided as per the requirements of the work breakdown structure and scope definition. This is an interesting example that how the banquet has been arranged, for example, for 100 people or 500 people. So the first level is the banquet, and then we divide this into further parts like planning and supervision, the dinner, the room and equipments, the guests, the staff, the speakers. And then we may go to level, next level is the planning, then budgeting, disbursement, reconciliation, coordination. In the menu, we can, dinner, we can think of things like menu, shopping list, shopping, cooking, serving. In the room and equipment, we may site, room, table, chairs, sitting, utensils, decorations, equipment, etc. In the guest, we have the guest list, regrets, name tags, special needs. In the staff, we have the shoppers, cooks, servers, hosts, cleanups. And similarly, we have the speaker, invite, transport, coordinators, wake up, no-shows, thank yous. And all these are then decided. This is a typical hierarchy of the work breakdown structure. For example, the level 1 is the project, and then we go to the level 2. So any subcomponent of this will be described by 1.1, and the further is then 1.1.1, and so on. So the level of the project sub component will be given by the dot, and it is a unique number. For example, if we go 1.1.2.9, it means that this relates to the first or 1.1 component of the project, and this is further divided, and this shows the fifth level. If you see the number of digits or integers are 1, 2, 3, 4, so it's the fourth level. And if it is further divided like 1.1.2.9.4, this is level 5. So we go down to the different levels depending on the complexity of the project and the need of the work breakdown structures. So for example, this is another example that you intranet WBS in tabular form. For example, evaluate the current system, define the requirements. Within the requirements, you may go for further division like define the user requirement, define the content requirements, define the system requirements, define the server and owner requirements. Similarly, 1.3 can be specific functionality, and you see this is within the concept. Define risk and risk management, develop the project plan, and so. And the second component of this project can be website design. The third can be website development. The fourth will be rollout, and the fifth may be support. So within one project, we can further divide into subcomponents depending on the need. Now, for the good work breakdown structures, it must be independent. That the components we divide, the project components must be independent, so that it can be executed independently, and we can also establish the responsibility and accountability of different groups for doing these subcomponents. It must be identifiable. It should not be overlapping in the sense that the teams which are assigned these various components of the project should be well identified. Integratable, that once we do all these components, we should integrate them into a single project, and the measurable, that these should be measurable when we are doing it. There must be a visible quantification of the achievement of the subcomponents. There are other kinds of organizational breakdown structure. For example, breakdown structure, we also divide the organization according to the work breakdown structure, and many times we establish a relationship between the work breakdown structure and organizational breakdown structure. So what we do, that the hierarchical organized depiction of the project organization is arranged so that the packages can be assigned and related to organizational units. For example, if I take the example of the engineering project, we have 5 components. So the civil work is then assigned to the director works. The procurement of furniture is assigned to the furniture procurement office, and then the procurement of IT equipment is assigned to the director IT to develop the different specifications, and similarly the human resource development is then developed to the registrar office and the human resource development center to develop the TORs, and similarly. So under this system, we assign the individual packages to different organs of the organization, and we then establish the responsibility. Bill of material, it is sometimes we call it bill of quantities or bill of material, which describes the tabulation of physical assemblies and components needed to fabricate and manufacture products. So this is another way that you determine the various material and labor required for the fabrication of a component. Similarly, we have the REX breakdown structure, in which we also divide the entire REX into smaller components. And then we have the resource breakdown structure, in which we try to see that how the resources would be broken down and divided amongst the various components of the project. Now, when we are creating the work breakdown structures, it should be one unit should appear in one place. For example, if we are developing the work breakdown structure of a building project, then we should the concreting or concreter, which is a component of the work breakdown structure, should appear once in the work breakdown structure, and all the quantities of the concrete which we will do in different levels of the building should come under that unit. The second is that work content of the WS, some of the WS item below it. So if we have the concrete quantity, for example, 100,000 CFT cubic feet, then the subcomponent like the concrete in foundation, concrete in flooring, concrete in the slab, beams, and all together when summed up should give the total quantity of the WBS item. A WBS item is the responsibility of only one individual, even though many people may be working on it. This is very important that when we develop the WBS, we assign that to a particular individual or group, and they are normally accountable to that. WBS must be consistent with the way in which work is actually going to be performed. It should serve the project team first and other purposes only if practical. This is very important that the WBS must be developed in a natural way, so that the way the project is executed, and it should be friendly and useful to the project team. Project team members should be involved in developing the WBS to ensure consistency in buying. This is very important that when we develop the WBS and the hierarchies of the project subcomponents, we should set with the project office and see that every component is well carefully adopted. Each WBS item must be documented to ensure accurate understanding the scope of work included in that item. So it should be properly documented so that we can control the work breakdown components. The WBS must be flexible tool to accommodate inevitable changes while properly maintaining control of the work content in the project according to the scope statement. So it should be a flexible tool. It should have some flexibility, because just like the management by objective, that we review the scope and the work breakdown structure periodically and see that if there is any change possible within the approved scope, then we can do that. So we create the WBS, and for this WBS, we normally need to have the project statement, then we have the requirement, we decompose the WBS, and we have the WBS diagram, and then we have the dictionary, the baseline, and the project document is accordingly updated based on this step. The scope change control, we will discuss this later, but The scope change control is both costly and time consuming. Scope change can be controlled by scope change control, formal process to change in terms of cost, time, and quality, and scope change control verification, that the process of documenting the project processes and key stakeholder to sign off. So while we are uh, uh, verifying the scope, we have to be very careful that there is no substantial change in the scope, because that would lead to additional cost and additional time, and maybe the quality is also sacrificed. To minimize the scope change, there are the requirements must be very carefully developed at the beginning, with due diligence and consultation with the users, because any requirement which is not developed, which are not developed in consultation and coordination with the user, will later on create a lot of changes in the scope. The IBM developed a joint application design tool in which the users are made part of the design development in terms of their consultation, their feedback. Put all requirements in writing and keep them current and readily available. This is really very important, that whatever requirements we finally resolve from the client and from the user, it must be properly documented and signed off by both the parties. Educate testing through project life cycle, that the testing must be provided. Create formalized change control system. The change control should not be informal. It should not be very casual. There must be a sign of process for the involvement of the relevant stakeholders to any formalized change, and stick to completion date. That if you are not completing the project in time, there will be a lot of scope changes coming from different stakeholders. Now, the scope verification, it is very difficult to create a good scope statement and WF for a project. It is even more difficult to verify the scope and minimize the scope changes. Many IT projects suffer from scope creep and poor scope verifications. For example, the Foxmeyer drug filed a bankruptcy after scope creep of robotic warehouse. So this project badly failed, and they bankrupted. This was a very good robot company. Engineers at Grumman called a system Naziware and refused to use it. And this was again the name of the software which was not adopted and accepted. 21st Century Insurance Company group wasted a lot of time and money in a project that could have used off-the-shelf components. So this is another very important thing, that when you are developing the user requirement, you have to see that is there any off-the-shelf available solution, because if you develop a thing which has already been developed 2 years back, you will waste a lot of time and money again. Verify the scope. The scope change during the execution of project. We have the inspections, we have the testings, we have different kinds of observations through which we try to see that the scope of the project is verified during the execution. So this is a monitoring and control process in which we try to verify the scope of the project through inspection, through testing. We have a different testing mechanism in which we have inspection, we have the quality system. So once this scope is accepted, we may get some change request. Now this is one of the survey which tells us though this is very old, almost 15 years old now, but it gives us the top 10 factors which lead to the project delays and cost overruns in the IT projects. For example, the user inputs or requirements of the users are not properly developed. This is the top ranked problem. Then incomplete requirement and specification, again changing requirement and specification. So the second ranked problem then is because of the frequent changes, lack of executive support, technology incompetence, lack of resources, unrealistic expectations, unclear objectives, unrealistic timeframes, and new technologies. So these were one of the chaos survey. Johnson Jim, the dollar drain of information technology project failures. Now, to improve the scope control, develop a good project selection process and insist that sponsors are from the user organization. Have users on the project team in important roles, have regular meetings, deliver something to user and sponsor on a regular basis, co-locate users with developers. So the more frequent you meet with the with the users, there will be more and more understanding, and there will be less change in the scope. We can use some softwares for the project scope management. For example, we can use the word processing software, helps create several scope related documents. We can use a spreadsheet for the financial calculations. For the quantity calculations, we can use some drawings. Communication software like emails and web help verify and communicate the scope information. The project management software help in creating WBS, and it's very common in the Primavera and the building information modeling. Specialized software is available for applying the balance scorecard, creating mind maps, managing requirements, and so on. So there are different tools, but normally the very common tools of MS word processing can be also very useful to assess the project scope change or project scope controls. Lastly, that we need to control the scope change because there is always variances in the project. So we have the requirement document, we have the requirement traceability matrix, we have the process assets, and then we have the variance analysis. So we see the performance of the work measurement, we see the change request, and accordingly project management plans are updated and the project documents are also updated. Now, some of the best practices to manage the scope is to get signed document for sponsor right in the beginning, clear scope statement, clear approvals of the plans. Change process must be very clearly documented. The project management authority must be very clear. Other project approvals involve team in planning, take responsibility and ownership, monitor and control, monitor against baseline, look for scope change approvals, formal deliverables, technical requirements, formal acceptance and sign-offs, communications, email, minutes, correspondence, constant validation and verification. So these are some of the tools which we are using very frequently in the projects to control the project scope. So thank you very much, gentlemen. With this, we are finished with the project scope management, but certainly the project scope management or the project scope control is one of the biggest challenge we often face in the projects, because the users are normally are very optimistic, and all the time they need to bring changes in the project. But certainly, if the change in the scope of the project is more frequent, then the project completion become really a very challenge. So there is a very famous quote that the project become problem when the rate of the progress or rate of the change in the scope is more than the rate of the progress in the project, or when the scope changes more than the progress of the project. So every other day, you bring new changes in the project, and the project then never completes. So the scope management should be very strictly done from the very beginning by the project sponsor, by the project management team, by the auditors, so that we can strictly control the projects. Certainly, when we control the project scope, we definitely control the time and cost also. So thank you very much. For next time, we will see the time, maybe the time management, if we have not already covered that. Thank you very much and have a nice time. And please remember me and my family in your supplications and in your dua and sujood. And inshallah, I also pray that may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give you all more good health with Iman, and we are given more strength to offer supplications to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Thank you very much, and have a nice time.